Thank you, Bob. That was really terrific. And at this point, we're going to continue the conversation. I'd like to invite our panelists up to the stage to join the panel. And maybe I'll start introducing the panel. So the panel will include the speakers who you've already seen. That includes Dr. Mauri, Dr. Bill Maisel, and Dr. Bob Harrington. And in addition, we have Dr. Florence Bourgeois, who is the co-director of the Harvard-MIT Center for Regulatory Science and Associate Professor of Pediatrics, Harvard Medical School, and Bram Zuckerman, Dr. Bram Zuckerman, who is the director of the Cardiovascular Device Center at CDRH FDA. So that was a fantastic talk, Bob. And maybe I'll start, maybe Bram, with you. And you've heard, I think, a morning of examples of observational data that have been used to at least inform some of the regulatory decisions that you are making every day. You've heard Dr. Harrington make the strong argument for the need for greater randomization as well as the clinical barriers with it. How is the FDA and specifically you in the cardiovascular area thinking about the tension between more randomized data and more observational data? And then secondarily, when is it that when you see observational comparative data, what are the things that you're looking for that will make you believe that data or use it for regulatory purposes?
Is this on?
Yep.
Okay. Do you have any easy questions? Well, first I'd like to really compliment Dr. Harrington. He gave a marvelous talk just now of where we should ultimately end up. But it is a visionary talk, and it's going to take some time and resources. The challenge that the FDA has is that we also have to work in the here and now, and we have acute problems of device safety and effectiveness in the post-market arena. The biological environment for many implants is a harsh one. It can't be fully predicted by rigorous bench testing. So we need to come up with reasonable pathways for making sure, as Dr. Maisel indicated, that devices remain safe and effective when they are utilized in the real world. Now, this morning we had some marvelous examples of how better methodology and really integration of multiple stakeholders can improve our present clinical trials ecosystem. And certainly as an FDA regulator, as opposed to the FDA commissioner right now, I'm very interested in the here and now that can be implemented sooner rather than later. And what I would maintain, Bobby, is that we do need to develop a continued collaboratory where we talk about how improved methodology in the post-market arena for multiple devices can be implemented. And that type of really dialogue needs to take place between academicians like you and Dr. Semsky, industry colleagues like Dr. Mauri, and FDA regulators, because I certainly saw a lot that could be gained from the case examples. Each example we could spend the whole day on, and we still won't have made all the learning. So I do see the need for a continuation of this process, because I think the fundamental point that I might agree with Dr. Harrington on, and I think everyone in this audience might agree on, is that the current ecosystem can use some improvement, and we want to do that sooner rather than later. So does that partially answer your question number one? For question number two, you're asking when can we say treatment B is better than treatment A? And traditionally, the agency has utilized the randomized controlled trial experiment to really remove concerns about bias and confounding, to make a definitive statement that sponsors can be used for their advertising and labeling. With observational data, perhaps we'll get there someday. I think that we need continued development of methodology and looking at how these comparisons compare to randomized trial data. But I think the real challenge with observational data relates to the work that you and others have been doing, where we have potentially basic safety issues that we want to define within a certain delta. And it doesn't really matter whether it's a little bit better or a little bit worse. We need to get better precision for safety as a first approach.
Great. Laura, my guess is that a lot of the things that Bob was just talking about, you would agree strongly with in your academic background as a clinical trialist as well. And I'm curious if your perspective on the use of real world data versus randomized clinical trial data has changed in your roles, in your different roles as a clinical trialist in academia versus being the chief medical officer, scientific officer in Medtronic.
I guess the simple answer is no. I don't think so. I think I guess I would start with, at the end of the day, all the stakeholders are tasked with making a choice that's going to benefit patients. And so I think everyone's interested in finding the right answers. And I think that's how Miguel opened this symposium. That's the goal, is to find the answers in a reliable way. And I think that's what, even before making a kind of transition. And I think all of us probably don't think as discreetly about whether trials are competing with observational analysis, as Isa was talking about earlier, but rather that we have questions and we want to find the best way to answer them. And we want to provide the best treatments for patients in a timely way, whether that means understanding if something's effective early on, or whether it means surveilling them for their safety afterwards. So I think that there will always be a need for both types of work. And I agree wholeheartedly with Bob that that there's a lot of interest and effort, and it's important to simplify how we do clinical trials and to educate on how they can be best performed. But we can't masquerade, randomization as solve everything, because inadequate randomized trials are also problematic. And likewise, the work that's being done in the medical device space, or more broadly, to develop better methods and understand the appropriateness of different methods for observational data, I think is critically important. So I guess it's all about just getting the best information to be able to provide the right treatments in the most suitable way for patients, regardless of what the methods are. And then educating the community, I think, that need to make decisions to help people better understand how to process the information. I think one of the biggest barriers that we have is just the tremendous access to information, to analytic tools, but less access perhaps to the critical judgment and skills to be able to interpret the information.
Yeah, that's I think something that everybody in this room agrees with strongly is the dissemination and arming people with that knowledge base to be able to understand the data in front of them, combined with the clinical subject matter expertise, as Bob, you've talked about before and this morning, is going to be really critical for the improvement of the use of methodologies and applying them to important questions. Bob, I want to ask you, you heard Dr. Maisel make the case this morning that devices were fundamentally different. And that maybe because they are so different that we can do fewer randomized trials, certainly smaller ones. And is it fair to say that you think that there are maybe more similarities there and that we should be doing? Is that more trials in that space, in the device space specifically? Is that too much of a cop out? Are we walking away from trials that we should be doing?
Well, Bill can certainly speak for himself, but I would say there's sort of two pieces of that. First of which is the regulations, the law that governs device approval is different than the law that governs drug approval and subsequent use. So we have to accept that they are different. And the putting in or the implantation of devices, the use of devices is also different than drugs. But I think many of the things that we do in cardiovascular medicine, there has been a bit of a cop-out on appropriately exposing the device to randomized trial. I appreciate Bram's point that devices also undergo this iterative process. And some of you will remember, some of you are old enough to remember, certainly Bram, Bill and I are old enough to remember that many years ago, there was a device on the market called directional atherectomy. And this was going to shave out plaque and open up arteries. And my God, doesn't that sound awesome? Like that would take out the plaque and it's going to work. And so we did a randomized clinical trial. It's called Caveat. And it showed not only did the device not help, in fact, it was harmful in some ways. More complications for the patients, more heart attacks. The aficionados of the device says, well, clearly the guys at Duke that designed this study know nothing about devices. We're going to design a new trial, and it had a great name. It was called BOAT, Balloon Optimal Atherectomy Trial. So now we're going to do it. Those Duke guys messed it up. So we're going to do an optimal atherectomy trial. Guess what? The results were the same. And so I think it's easy to say, no, I know. And I'll pick on your example, Bobby, of mechanical circulatory devices, because you know this is one of my pet peeves. Any takers in the audience for how much money Johnson & Johnson just paid for the company that makes Impella? Any takers?
We have somebody who knows.
Actually, it went over 17 billion. So $17 billion. Come on. Every indication with all of I would agree with the introduction of Bobby. Like the Smith Center is probably the best at doing this work. And it looks like it might be harmful. Or at least we can't rule out harm. How many patients would it take in cardiogenic shock to understand if it was helping or hurting? I'll give you three numbers: less than 1,000, more than 1,000, but less than 5,000, more than 5,000. Less than 1,000. It would take about 500 to 700 patients. That with would you give the event rate 40 to 50% mortality?
Yeah.
We've done trials in cardiogenic shock. They are hard, but you can do them. And you can rule people in or out that the thing's working or not. So I would say that's a failure of us as a community. And I put myself as a reformed interventionalist in the category of we failed. So yeah, I think it's a cop-out. I think we should. I cannot believe that we as a community don't demand that we study this device in a randomized clinical trial.
Who should be making the demand? Is that?
I think clinicians should be making. If clinicians lined up and went to the company and said, we need randomized clinical trial data to continue using this device. Laura's shaking her head. She knows that that's what would happen.
I'm shaking my head because the reason that it would happen is that there's not that demand.
Correct. But if the clinicians demanded it, what would the company do?
They would do the trial.
They would do the trial.
But you know, I would say there's some gray, right? Because you and I as interventionists, right, know that there are things that make procedures easier. And so where do you draw that?
Yeah, I agree.
Of where that randomization versus, you know, I know this is working. And there is I feel strange saying that in the Harvard School of Public Health, but there is a gray area between those two things.
Agreed, which is great for community equipoise in a randomization.
And it should be said, it should be said that the trial is being pursued.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that
After the
Um,
$17 billion deal was signed.
I think that the company should be applauded for actually embarking on the very difficult randomized clinical trial that they're conducting. And I think the other thing that has been brought up is this idea of informed consent, which you brought up. And in this trial, one particular feature, which is exciting, is the exemption from informed consent as a possibility going into the community. And that's something that I think we've spoken about that, our group quite a bit, and as many others have, which is when we are essentially randomizing based on the preferences that we have, which, thankfully those preferences can be random, and that's why we use IVs sometimes based on those preference variables. But why can't we formally randomize when we really have equipoise? And Florence, maybe I'll ask you, because you take care of a population of patients that is very understudied. And we were talking at lunch how most of the devices that you use have never been studied in the population, or that are used by your colleagues, have never been studied in the population that they're used for in kids. And there are these populations which will never be included in randomized, or at least in the current state, are not going to be included in randomized clinical trials. Those include children, vulnerable populations, disadvantaged communities at facilities that don't have the capabilities. And so how should we be thinking about randomized clinical trials or randomized evidence, or just evidence that in general in the understudied populations, many of them that we take care of?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So certainly for kids, the question or the issue of how can we use real world data in a better way, because we have small patient populations in kids. There are ethical concerns. Pediatric trials tend to be a lot more expensive, and on the industry side, there's just less appetite to really get into the pediatric market. And pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies tend to be the primary sponsors. So we are left with this landscape where we need to find alternate methods to generate robust evidence, and real world evidence and real world data will be one of those. What I've come across doing studies in EHR data and register data is that oftentimes the data simply aren't adequate. So it's really the quality of the evidence that is still lacking. So if we can commit to the need for observational data to complement RCTs, and if we can agree on that, then we should also invest more in having observational data that are robust and adequate for these studies. And the primary item that I would mention in that regard that actually hasn't come up today are unique device identifiers. So something as simple as quantifying what devices are we using in kids in an off-label fashion is impossible to do currently. Doesn't matter how large your data set is, we cannot identify devices implanted in children because all we have are CPT codes. And the study that was presented this morning with the CPT code for the unibody versus other devices is a very unique situation where you have a CPT code that enables that differentiation. I think they've even gotten rid of that, haven't they? Yeah. So without that, if we only have CPT codes, how do we know what devices are being used in kids? How can we identify where the gap is? What adult devices are we using in kids for what procedures? And that would be a starting point to even identify where a randomized controlled trial might be needed. But even before that, where is more development and investment required?
Bill, can I put you on the spot then and ask, where is the FDA with regard to thinking about UDI, implementing UDI more pervasively so it can be utilized for things like Florence is describing? And then I want to say that we would love for this to be interactive, and for the next 15 minutes, gather your questions. This is a great opportunity to ask this really esteemed panel. So I'll be, calling on people with their questions in the next 10, 15 minutes as well.
So FDA passed a final rule, which means it's a requirement for UDI 10 years ago, and it was a multi-year phased-in approach. And as of last year, all devices must bear a UDI. We have what's called our Good ID database that's publicly available, where companies are required to put in the UDI and certain attributes of the devices. The issue is that we don't have the authority to require the UDI to be put into a medical record. We don't have the authority to require it to be in claims data. And so there is an effort to incorporate UDI into claims data. CMS has been working on this. There's a task force that updates the claims data forms periodically. It's a multi-year process and it has not been finalized, but it appears likely that the next iteration will incorporate UDI for high-risk devices. Still working around what the definitions of high risk will be, still working around implementation timelines, which are on CMS and others. But I think it's, inevitable that there will be UDI claims data at some point for at least high risk devices, which is good and will offer obviously a lot of opportunity for use of real world evidence. Before I hand you back the mic, I cannot, he used the word cop out. I want to.
But I didn't hear you with
I
that.
understand. And I will say, before making my comments, I did check the exits in case the crowd decides to rush the stage. Obviously clinical trials are randomized clinical trials are super important and have a hugely important role, particularly for, game-changing new technologies. I think atherectomy is a great example. I mean, the road is littered with devices that have failed randomized trials. They're super important. But I do think we should challenge ourselves to think about what needs to happen in order for us to make better use of real world data. And Bobby, your presentation, I think, is a great example. The data set you showed, looking at this intervention, clearly didn't have a critical characteristic that was impacting the treatment outcome. The data set was incomplete. And I think our hypothesis in that case is it's the physician judgment. It just wasn't being captured. And so, and there's a lot of cases like that. We walk into a heart failure patient room and you look at the patient and you get a feeling about the patient. You have an instinct. And so one area would be to try to do better at creating databases that do a better job at capturing the things that are impacting the outcome. An example that comes to mind, a related example, I was thinking about hurricane forecasting. You don't randomize hurricane forecasting, but if you went back 20 years ago, it was a crapshoot. It was really difficult to predict where a hurricane goes, and they study it and they start collecting data and they start analyzing it. What data can we look at that will predict the outcome in a reliable and an accurate way? And that cone of uncertainty gets narrower and narrower and narrower. And when I think of real world data and real world evidence, I think of a cone of uncertainty. And what can we do as a community to do better in our analysis, in our methodology, in the way we're collecting data and the questions we're asking about real world data, so that a decade from now, when we're asking these questions, we understand it a lot better. We go, oh, well, of course, that heart, that physician, we can see that the nurse said, filled out this form, or had, we had them rated on a scale of 1 to 8. They gave it a 7. This was a sick patient. Or, finding ways to get better data that will make our real world data more useful. So I think there's methodologies, but I don't want to just fall back on randomized clinical trials as being the solution, because we'll end up delaying, some of those therapies are going to be good therapies. And that delay in getting those therapies to patients is harmful. And it's a cost that we don't think about and we don't measure. But it is a cost.
Yeah, I
Okay, now it's time to go to the audience.
No, I completely agree with you. I don't think we should stall the progress of doing a better job of capturing data. I've wanted for a long time in clinical trials to capture data every day as to what the clinician thinks, how that patient is doing. Because what do? We're stuck with baseline characteristics. And as soon as you look at a characteristic after randomization, all hands go up and say, oh, no, that's a post-randomization variable, and we can't include that. So I would love to have more data and be able to use, time-dependent analysis to figure out day by day what's going on. So I'm on board. My point about copping out is I don't think the FDA copped out. You're working with a set of tools that you have. I think we as a community copped out, is that, and we all know this, that doctors have no short of confidence about what's working and what isn't working. And Stead knew this 50 years ago when it formed the data bank, which is that you tend to remember the good things and have less memory of the bad things. And so I'm not relieving me and my colleagues from saying that we cocked up. Not yet.
Miguel.
I'd like to ask you some kids for the point that both Laura and Florence have made, and also using some of the examples that both gave. So I think that the elephant in the room we're talking about randomized trials, observational real world data studies, is that many more people know how to distinguish between a good randomized trial and the bad randomized trial, between the bad observational study and the good observation system. And this applies to the editors of clinical journals, this applies to FDA, this applies to I mean, there are many observational studies that are published that very bad. Not necessarily because the data are bad, because what is done with the data is bad. Bob gave this example of the commentary by colleagues and authors at the International Conference. They give examples in that commentary, this is 2020, of observational studies that are obviously wrong. People here at CAUSALab, like Harvard and have shown that they are wrong because they did the wrong thing with the data. If you take the same data and you do they give you the same answer as trials. So all these comparisons about observational studies that don't give you the same answer is very confused by the fact that maybe they're not doing what they have to do, and the journals are not being very good at picking that up. You also gave the example of convalescent plasma. That's an example in which when also people at the Boston VA with people from the CAUSALab, when they look at the VA data on convalescent plasma, they found exactly the same thing that the trial found. So there are many examples in which we're saying that observational studies are wrong. Yeah, it's basically because we're doing things with the observational data that we will never do with data from the trials. As soon as you start treating the observational data as seriously as the data from trials, the picture starts. So this is my question, and this is kind of free consulting for that I'm asking for. So we at the CAUSALab are trying to help people use observational data. We offer courses. We teach in other ways that we can do. We have use cases. We have that we publish. We have collaborations, but sometimes it is frustrating that it doesn't reach the journals, the FDA, and other people. So how can we do better?
Who wants to start?
It's a great question.
Laura?
It's the question I've been asking myself for the past 24 hours, probably longer than that, probably years, but I mean, I think it starts with what's happening in this room. I mean, the fact that we're all together sharing this, and that we're all going to go out to different sectors and educate people and use it in our day-to-day work. I think that's really important. But how do we do it faster? That's really what worries me about how do we keep up with the pace of information and analytics that's available with the education, how to interpret it. And I think that's a problem we need to solve. Maybe it's not on the horizon of enough broadly enough, because we talk a lot about using artificial intelligence for this, for that, or the other thing. I do wonder, what can we simplify so that you don't have to know everything? Are there elements that we can simplify? And some of it's going to require judgment. I mean, it's a little bit like the analogy to medical practice. I don't think we can suddenly turn out people who are critical thinkers and have the experience of walking in a room and knowing who's sick and those sorts of things that took years to learn. And it's very difficult for us to put on paper. But artificial intelligence is getting better at putting in more information to be able to distill that. I don't have a great framework for exactly how we do that for studies design or for research design, but it seems like there should be a way to take some of those simple elements and improve.
I'll just add to that with just a very sort of pragmatic maybe suggestion, which is that if the way we as clinicians primarily consume trial evidence is still through journal publications. What can we do at the level of journals, journal editors and reviewers to ensure that the appropriate reviewers are selected, and that in-house they have the appropriate statistical editors and reviewers to ensure that observational studies are reviewed appropriately. And I think that's doubly important, not only to generate the right evidence, but also because we all learn from other studies. When we're designing our own studies, we look at methods from published observational studies. So it would sort of help really advance everyone's rigor and higher quality understanding for observational studies.
Right.
Okay, so that's the visionary aspect, but from a regulator's aspect, I would suggest that this is something that the FDA promotes, is that a collaboratory on this topic be established that's led by academicians, that integrates as collaborators and colleagues, industry, and certainly the FDA. And I would suggest that you develop it with maybe an overall global vision, as mentioned by Dr. Hernan, but start with specific case examples like the peripheral vascular disease arena that's been mentioned today could really benefit from just using better methodology in a concerted fashion. I don't think you're going to educate the whole world overnight, but having a case example would certainly benefit the medical device industry. I'd be interested in Dr. Mauri's comments about how could we attract industry stakeholders to this effort, because they could play a very large role in raising the level of the water in the dam.
I want to make sure I understand your question, Bram. So are you asking on a specific question or in general?
Well, I think there's a need for development of better observational methodology in the medical device world. Let's keep it devices, not drugs. So the question is to do that in a practical way. I think really needs the collaboration of academics, regulators, and just as importantly, industry, so that they will use this methodology, and using this methodology, I think, will have an impact on clinicians because they'll see a different perspective. So I think industry participation would be critical for actually developing case examples. But what does industry need as carrots to play in this sandbox or work in this sandbox?
I mean, I personally think that I don't know that there's a carrot needed. I think many of the examples that you saw today involved that approach of collaboration across these different stakeholders, because it gets us better information, especially when we align prospectively, just like we align for a randomized trial design or we align for an observational design. It's useful to everyone. Now, collaborating across multiple industry partners is probably the more challenging thing than collaborating with single industry partners, because companies vary so much in their interests and size. But I think it's advancing, it's taking opportunities where they exist to be able to bring parties together. And that's, I think that has been a way of working within, certainly within the interventional cardiology space for medical devices. It could be brought into other areas.
And we have had some conversations, Bram, as you know, about establishing an academic research consortium style meeting related to figuring out consensus standards for observational research methods for real world data analysis. I want to go back to Florence's comment about journals and journal editors, and Bob, I'm gonna look at you here in another hat as someone who's been a journal editor for a long time. Where is the challenge? What is the challenge in the conversations you've had during the editorial board meetings when you're interpreting real world evidence, comparative effectiveness studies? Is it the difficulty of getting quality reviewers? Is there not enough expertise on the editorial boards, or is it maybe not a problem with the journals that you've been on at all? So what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, in disclosure, I'm one of the associate editors for JAMA Cardiology, which is sort of different than other journals because we have all the resources of JAMA behind it. There is a trouble finding reviewers. How many times can you review a manuscript or somebody within the Smith Center? I bet we send you a lot because there's a limited pool. Part of it is we have to expand that reviewing pool, and that's difficult. JAMA has the advantage. We have full-time statistical support on the editorial board that's paid for by JAMA. So we have a little bit of an advantage that some of the other journals don't have, where they're really reliant on the volunteer peer review crowd. And if you happen to send it to somebody who's an expert, you get one review. If you send it to somebody who's not an expert, you get a very different review for some of the reasons that have been spoken. So yeah, elevating the quality of the community's knowledge on this topic is critically important. Critically important. It's very hard to do. There's not enough reviewers. How many papers do you review a month? Ballpark. A lot.
Yeah.
The other challenge to that, I just recall from having been in that position for other journals before, is that you could get a great statistical editor and you could get a great clinical editor or a reviewer, I'm sorry, but if you don't have somebody who can sort of bridge that gap and they don't have a conversation with one another, then they can't understand the paper.
Yeah, no, you have to have an editorial board that works to do what you said, which I think is so important. So I had said to a few of you, we meet every Friday morning at 5:30 a.m. Pacific time. That has another issue attached to it. But, you know, we routinely review 10 to 12 papers as a group with all sorts of expertise on the phone. And so a paper that gets through JAMA Cardiology, do we make mistakes? Absolutely. But I think we have a pretty robust discussion every week on the issues that you're talking about. And the good journals do that, right? Yeah.
Just reflecting on your talk, I think from the trial landscape, that the device approval process, IDE process, is typically based on the needs by the FDA. And cardiovascular, they do a lot of 510(k) applications, other types of process to get approval. But the emphasis on the post-market trial is hampered, in my viewpoint, primarily by funding. We see an AIDS trial. We've had a couple really hard ones in the vascular space. Project 2 trial with that COI that took 10 years. Many people discredit the result of that. The future PE trial that took so long to fund the NIH that whole piece of the devices came out while going through that process. So now we have a trial that makes sense. And so, and then afterwards, a poorly funded trial. And how do we? We've seen post-market requirements from the FDA that are typically now registry-based. How do we form the funding and the infrastructure for the post-market savings? I think a lot of us have a lot of interest in it, but also the practicality and answer the important part of this to DCR.
I don't think this is different than when Elliot and I wrote this piece a number of years ago. We said large trials have lost their original intent, which is simplicity. What did we used to call them? Large, simple trials. They're not simple. They're large, complicated trials. And I think we got to get back to sort of the essence of what are the key things you're trying to learn, and can you strip it down? Now that, as you all know, that's hard with investigators. There's like that extra piece of data they want to collect. I do think that some of the new tools of digital collection and remote monitoring and things like that will hopefully decrease the cost of the trials, but we have to decrease the cost of the trials, to your point. We also can't depend on, it has to be some mixture of public and private funding. There's just no way around it. The NIH has a limited budget. NHLBI, for example, spends less than 5% of its budget on clinical trials. They spend most of their budget on laboratory science, which is terrific, but less than 5% of their budget's on the big public health issue. So I think there's a lot of places, but we as a clinical trials community have to make things simpler. What do you think of adaptable cost? 15,000 patients, any takers? Less than $20 million. And think about that. Typical pharma trial of that size, what do you think would cost? Close to $1 billion. Yeah, so very different.
This is a question to all of the stakeholders in the panel. We live in a world in the US where our regulator and our primary payer for cardiovascular conditions, so FDA and CMS by design have different mandates and the almost one type responsibilities. If we were to reimagine this, what could the FDA and CMS work on together to solve both the data and evidence issues, and what would it take for us to get there?
I'll try to tackle that first because we are trying. So we have envisioned a plan that we call TAP, stands for Total Product Life Cycle Advisory Program. And the concept is we recognize, FDA only is one piece of patient access. And the reimbursement piece is important, not only for patients, but for getting technologies, survival of companies. And so what we are trying to do is pilot a program where we spend more time, more intensively, bringing the community together early in product development, and with FDA serving as the convener, if you will, where we pull in, the professional societies, patient perspectives, the payers, and so that at least the company would understand what is expected of them when they're ready to dip their toe in the water of the clinical data acquisition, not after the fact, not have to do another trial to then go get reimbursement. So, and hopefully if the payers, if the payers can come to the table early, they'll also understand, what the patients want, what the patients are saying, what the academic community is saying about what the right evidence expectations are. So we're piloting it right now in the cardiovascular office. We have just a few enrolled companies, and we will be spreading it gradually to the other product areas. So still a little bit of an untold story, but it is trying to make a difference in a small way on the point you raised.
Thank you.
I'm going to actually ask Miguel. Can I ask you a question? So we've been here all morning, and this panelists of clinicians, regulators. You're a methodologist. Many actually in the room are methodologists. You've seen some of the challenges. You've seen maybe some of the uses that we've had, some of the struggles that we've had with evidence in cardiovascular medicine for cardiovascular devices, trials, the limitations and the strength of the trials, and the limitations of the real world evidence. What is the opportunity that you see for our field from a methodology standpoint? Where are we, where do we need to turn to in the methods community? Are there obvious action items that you're seeing after this meeting that what we need to work on is add this set of methods. We need better data sets. What are the things that you're seeing and the opportunities that you're seeing?
Easy question at the end. I think there are two aspects here. One is the improvement of the methods, the one is the improvement of the data. And for the improvement of the methods, I think from what I understand from the work that the Smith Center is doing, you are at the cutting edge. I don't think there is something out there that you are not aware of and you're using. And obviously, you are having an impact in the field. But I'm not that worried about that part. I'm more worried about the data part. Because there are two types of data sets that will be. One is the observational data, the real data, and the other one is the randomized trial data. From the observational data point of view, I think that one problem that exists in this field and many other fields of medicine is that you may have very good data on the treatments themselves, on the devices, and even very good data on the outcomes, but not very good data on the compounds. And that, because that doesn't exist in claims. Really. So, and it's very hard to obtain from electronic records, even though there are some efforts that Florence and others are doing on those things. But the question is then, yes, how to generate those data? And you mentioned before we were talking about using registries with detailed clinical data that allows you to, in a very granular way, to know what is really going on and what are the reasons that people are getting one device versus the other, or versus no device. So I think that that's a challenge, not only for device research, but for other parts of medicine. And the other aspect is how we generate more data from the randomized trials. And that, I think, isn't much, even though for devices and drugs, the situation is a little bit different, like Bob said, but that's a much bigger question, especially when you take the US as a country, because many of these problems, in some sense, have been solved in other countries, in the sense that they do trials with registers like in Sweden, or they do trials like Bob was talking about in the UK for COVID. They taught us a lesson. The rest of the world, they were doing exactly the right thing. They were randomizing all these treatments in big platform trials, and actually we learned a few months later some treatments work and some treatments didn't. So why is that not happening in other countries like the US? What are the constraints there? Why the payers are not asking for this? I don't think that doctors asking for it will change as much, because not all doctors will ask for it. I think that we need a system of incentives in which the payers are actually asking for this data, or even a two-level system like happens in most of the Western world, in which after the FDA approves a treatment, then there is a health technology assessment agency that says, okay, you can sell the treatment, but nobody is going to pay for it until you show me that it works. I think we try also with observational studies, and that's two-level system in which there is an approval, and then there is an evaluation of benefits and costs head-to-head comparison, which is not required for approval, but are required for knowing whether something really works better than what already exists. I think that maybe devices are actually a very good breeding ground for that kind of change that could spread to other areas of medicine.
Yeah, it's interesting to think that, we have these great medical device registries as part of the National Cardiovascular Data Registry that Bob spoke about. But as of now, we sort of are prohibited from doing device-to-device comparisons in those registries. Florence was talking about that earlier in the STS registry, and we know the ECC and CDR registries don't currently allow us to do device-to-device comparisons. I don't know, maybe as a last comment, should we be allowed to do device-to-device, maybe I'll ask you, Laura, comparisons in the ECC and CDR registries?
I think you have to solve the problem of the reliability of the data first, because we know what happens when we do comparisons for the for data, and that would be my biggest concern. Not the fact of comparing things, because I think that's less of a problem than not understanding, not being able to make the right inference from those comparisons.
Bob, you're nodding.
I totally agree with Laura. It's been a big, I'm not involved with the NCDR right now, but it has been one of the big discussion points, to Laura's point. If you're going to do direct comparisons of different devices within a field, through the registry data, you better make sure that the methods are as sound as they can be, because and to Miguel's point, that the appropriate data has been collected and captured, et cetera, because the stakes are high if you get that wrong.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank all the panelists and the speakers today for really a wonderful day, wonderful symposium, our first joint collaborative symposium with the CAUSALab and the Smith Center. I think it's been a really successful day for us, and thank you, Miguel, especially for hosting us here. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Yes.
We're going to finish now. What a wonderful day. I hope that you have learned as much about science and causal inference and regulation and policy as I have. Before we invite you all to our post-symposium reception, I'd like to say thank you to a few people who had made this possible. So first, we are very grateful to our speakers and panelists who not only have shared their knowledge and experience, but actually they have stayed perfectly on time. It was so easy to handle this. So thank you very much. And also I want to thank Joanna Mikalski, who is from CAUSALab, and Sarah McEwen for the Smith Center for taking care of everything. Everything went very, very well. So thank you to both of you. I like to thank Alejandro Ismulevich, who is the Kolokotrones Fellow and has been working behind the scenes, also making sure that everything flowed well here. So thank you very much, Alejandro. And last but not least, I would like to thank the Kolokotrones Friday Symposium Fund, which was funded by the Kolokotrones family, and that is supporting this symposium. So thank you, and I hope to see you at the reception now. Thank you very much.